They laughed quietly at first. It was the kind of laughter that didn't need sound. A look exchanged across a table, a raised eyebrow, a note scribbled in the margin of a report. To them, American technology was loud, inefficient, and crude, an overhyped product of excess rather than discipline. At least, that's what they told themselves. Across the ocean, inside concrete buildings that smelled of ink, oil, and cigarette smoke, analysts convinced one another that the United States relied too heavily on money instead of intellect. Too many parts, too many comforts, too much freedom. In their worldview, that kind of system could never outperform one built on strict control and obedience. They believed Americans built machines the way they lived their lives, carelessly, indulgently, without precision. They were wrong, and the first warning signs appeared long before anyone was ready to admit it. A classified delegation arrived under the guise of routine observation, nothing unusual. Engineers, officers, technical advisors. The official purpose was verification. The real purpose was curiosity. They wanted to see how exaggerated the American claims really were. What they found unsettled them, but not enough to change their conclusions yet. The facilities looked unimpressive from the outside. No monumental architecture, no intimidating banners, no sense of ceremony. Just wide spaces, clean corridors, and people moving calmly, without fear. Too calmly. The visitors took notes. Americans smiled. Coffee was offered. Jokes were exchanged. That, more than anything, raised suspicion, because serious nations didn't joke about serious things. They assumed what they were seeing was a performance, carefully staged to impress outsiders. The real capabilities, they believed, were far more limited. One of the senior observers even wrote later that the Americans hid incompetence behind confidence. That sentence would age badly, very badly. The first system demonstration was scheduled for the following morning. Nothing dramatic, just a routine test. At least that's how it was presented. The observers settled into their seats, arms crossed, prepared to confirm what they already believed. Then the screen lit up. And something didn't add up. The data refreshed too quickly. The response times were too short. Signals appeared, disappeared, and reappeared in patterns that shouldn't have been possible, not with the technology they assumed the Americans had. A junior analyst leaned forward. He checked his notes. Then he checked the screen again. This wasn't matching the models. Someone whispered that the Americans must be simplifying the display, filtering data to make it look faster than it really was. That explanation felt comfortable. They clung to it because the alternative was worse, much worse. The demonstration continued. Inputs were introduced, unexpected ones. Variables changed in real time. The system adjusted instantly, without hesitation, without recalibration.
The room grew quieter. One observer cleared his throat and asked a technical question designed to expose the illusion. The American engineer answered casually, almost bored, and then, without being asked, triggered another test. This one was not on the schedule. Several observers exchanged looks. This wasn't arrogance, it was confidence, and confidence usually came from something solid. Still, pride is stubborn. They told themselves this was just one system, an isolated example, possibly experimental, possibly unreliable at scale. They left the facility unconvinced, but uneasy. That night, reports were written carefully, language was softened, concerns were buried under cautious phrasing. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but the thought had already taken root. What if American technology wasn't chaotic? What if it was simply ahead? The real shock came days later, not during a demonstration, but during a failure, a controlled failure, one the Americans didn't even try to hide. A system was intentionally pushed beyond its limits. The observers expected confusion, delays, frantic adjustments. Instead, the system shut itself down, cleanly, gracefully, then restarted, on its own. No panic, no shouting, no emergency protocols triggered, just a calm notification, issue identified, corrected, resolved. One of the visitors felt something cold settle in his stomach. Systems like this weren't just fast, they were resilient. That meant redundancy, independent decision-making, layers of planning. That meant doctrine. And doctrine meant this wasn't accidental. This was how Americans built everything. The delegation requested additional access. The Americans agreed, too easily. They were shown logistics hubs, maintenance depots, training centers, places that weren't meant to impress but did anyway. Everywhere the same pattern appeared, machines designed with the assumption that humans would make mistakes, and systems built to correct those mistakes automatically. That philosophy alone marked a dangerous difference, because while others trained people to serve machines, America built machines to serve people. The observers began to realize something unsettling. They weren't witnessing isolated brilliance, they were seeing an ecosystem, and ecosystems were hard to defeat. On the final day, one observer asked a question that wasn't in the script. What happens, he asked carefully, if this system is damaged during conflict? The American officer didn't hesitate. It adapts. The observer pressed, and if adaptation fails, it doesn't, the officer said calmly. It degrades. The word landed heavier than expected. Degrades. Not collapses, not fails, just degrades. That single distinction revealed more than any demonstration. It meant the Americans had already planned for loss, planned for chaos, planned for war. As the delegation departed, no one laughed anymore. The jokes were gone.
The raised eyebrows had disappeared. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, a realization began to spread, slowly, painfully, inevitably. They hadn't been mocking inferior technology. They had been mocking something they didn't understand. And what they didn't understand was already years ahead. Because this was only the surface, and the Americans hadn't even shown them the real thing yet. They returned home with questions they refused to ask out loud. Officially, the visit had been informative but inconclusive. Unofficially, it triggered an internal scramble. Meetings were scheduled behind closed doors. Old assumptions were reopened. Younger analysts were silenced when they spoke too freely. Senior officers demanded reassurance, not speculation. The reports circulated upward, stripped of emotion, reduced to numbers and cautious language. But numbers have a way of betraying the truth. Response times, error margins, recovery windows. Each comparison chipped away at the narrative they had carefully built for decades. American systems were not just comparable, they were operating in a different philosophy altogether. Still, pride delayed acceptance. Leadership insisted the demonstrations were selective, optimized for display, and untested under real pressure. Technology looks impressive in peacetime, one official remarked. War exposes weakness. That sentence became a comfort until war games began revealing something else. Across secure facilities, simulations were run using updated assumptions, slightly improved American capabilities, nothing radical. Even then, the results felt off. Scenarios that should have favored numerical superiority ended too quickly. Engagements expected to last days collapsed in hours. Communication disruptions that once guaranteed confusion now produced only minor delays. Someone quietly suggested the models were outdated. Someone else suggested the Americans were cheating. Neither explanation solved the problem. Because even when the Americans were intentionally handicapped in the simulations, the outcome barely changed. At first, the failures were blamed on flawed data, then on incompetent modelers, then on unrealistic assumptions. Every excuse was explored, except the most obvious one. What if the Americans had already solved problems others were still debating? That thought was dangerous, so it was suppressed. But reality doesn't care about suppression. It arrived unexpectedly, not in a laboratory or simulation, but during a routine international exercise meant to demonstrate balance and mutual understanding. Observers from multiple nations gathered. Cameras were allowed. Protocols were followed.
This time, the Americans didn't host, they participated. That difference mattered. The exercise began predictably. Standard maneuvers, expected formations, nothing that challenged established doctrine. The rivals relaxed. This was familiar territory. Then something subtle changed. American units began operating differently. Not aggressively, efficiently. They moved with an ease that suggested they weren't reacting, they were anticipating. Communications were minimal. Adjustments happened before commands were issued. It was as if the system already knew what would be needed next. One observer noted that American units were operating ahead of the exercise. That didn't make sense. Exercises were scripted, unless the Americans weren't following the script. The first anomaly was dismissed as coincidence. The second raised eyebrows. By the third, the room was silent. Every time conditions shifted, American responses arrived early, sometimes seconds early, sometimes minutes. Not rushed, not frantic, just already there. A technical advisor requested clarification. The answer was vague but polite. Automated support, he was told. Integrated systems. That explanation should have raised alarms. Instead, it was accepted, until an unscheduled variable was introduced. A minor disruption, nothing dramatic. A simulated communication failure, the kind of thing designed to test adaptability. Observers leaned forward, expecting confusion. American units slowed, then redistributed, then continued, not flawlessly, but deliberately. Where others froze, waiting for instructions, Americans adjusted locally. Decisions happened at lower levels, guided by systems that prioritized outcomes instead of orders. The disruption lasted less than 5 minutes. Afterward, an uncomfortable question lingered. If this was how Americans operated during an exercise, what would they do during a real conflict? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Not through combat, through interception. Weeks later, an incident occurred far from cameras and observers. A test launch, officially announced, carefully monitored, meant to reaffirm capability. Instead, it exposed vulnerability. Sensors detected something impossible. The object had been tracked earlier than projected, its path predicted before confirmation. Defensive systems reacted before authorization was even requested. By the time human operators acknowledged the event, American systems had already classified it, analyzed it, and prepared responses. No engagement occurred, no escalation followed, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching, and not passively. Internal investigations followed. Engineers reviewed their own systems, searching for leaks, miscalculations, or espionage. None were found, which meant the Americans hadn't cheated. They had simply seen first. That realization sent ripples through institutions built on secrecy and control. Because surveillance superiority wasn't just about better sensors, it meant better integration, better processing, better trust between humans and machines. The Americans weren't faster because they pushed harder. They were faster because they had already decided what mattered.
One analyst, younger and less careful, put it bluntly during a private meeting. They don't wait for permission to think. The room fell silent. That sentence crossed a line. But it was accurate. Where others centralized decision-making, Americans distributed it. Where others feared mistakes, Americans engineered around them. Where others demanded certainty, Americans planned for uncertainty, and uncertainty favored them. Requests were made for deeper analysis, comparative studies, reverse engineering, something, anything that could explain the gap. The results were unsettling. American advantages weren't concentrated in one area. They were everywhere. Manufacturing tolerances, software modularity, training philosophy, logistics planning, even documentation clarity. Each component was slightly better, slightly more adaptable. Individually, those differences seemed manageable. Together, they were overwhelming, because no single breakthrough explained American superiority. It was the accumulation of thousands of small decisions, each favoring flexibility over control. One senior official finally voiced the unthinkable. "This isn't a technology problem," he said quietly. "It's a system problem." No one argued.
Because systems reflect values, and changing values is harder than copying machines. Attempts were made anyway. Budgets were redirected, programs restructured, new doctrines drafted. Words like adaptability and initiative appeared in documents that once dismissed them as weaknesses. But implementation faltered. Because you cannot simulate trust, you cannot order creativity, and you cannot command innovation into existence. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Americans continued refining quietly. No grand announcements, no dramatic declarations, just incremental improvements layered onto systems already years ahead. They didn't need to mock anyone. Reality was doing that for them. The final confirmation came not through intelligence, but confession. A private conversation, a trusted channel, a moment of unguarded honesty between professionals who understood the stakes. One side asked a simple question: how far ahead are you really? The American response was measured. Far enough, he said, that we don't worry about catching up. We worry about staying balanced. Balanced. The word echoed longer than intended, because balance implies excess, and excess implies dominance. By the time that conversation ended, the truth was no longer avoidable. The Americans hadn't surged ahead suddenly. They had been pulling away quietly for years. And what the world had seen so far was still not the part they feared the most, because technology was only half the story, and the other half was about to reveal itself. The realization didn't trigger panic, it triggered denial. Institutions built on control rarely collapse loudly. They erode quietly, resisting truth not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. Committees were formed.
Counter-studies commissioned. Analysts instructed to reframe conclusions. The problem wasn't the data, it was the interpretation. So the interpretation was adjusted. American systems, they claimed, were overly complex, vulnerable to disruption, dependent on uninterrupted infrastructure. Impressive, yes, but fragile. A glass sword. Powerful, but brittle. That explanation restored confidence, briefly. Then came the test no one could control. It began as an accident. A weather anomaly disrupted a routine operation. Nothing classified, nothing aggressive. Just a convergence of bad timing, equipment strain, and human fatigue. The kind of scenario every doctrine pretends won't happen, except it did. Communications degraded, visibility dropped, multiple units lost coordination simultaneously. In theory, this was the moment superiority should reassert itself. Instead, something else happened. American systems didn't fight the chaos, they absorbed it. Local units adjusted independently. Priorities shifted automatically. Non-essential tasks shut down. Resources rerouted without awaiting approval. The system didn't search for perfect information, it worked with what it had. What others called fog of war, Americans treated as baseline conditions. Observers struggled to track what was happening, not because it was fast, but because it was decentralized. No single command center, no dramatic orders, just thousands of small decisions aligning toward the same outcome. When communications partially restored, the picture was already clear. The Americans hadn't just maintained effectiveness, they had improved it. Someone whispered that this shouldn't be possible. Someone else whispered that it had already happened before. And that's when a pattern emerged. American strength wasn't reactive, it was anticipatory. They didn't wait for failure to respond. They designed systems assuming failure was inevitable. That distinction mattered more than any weapon. Internal pressure intensified. Leadership demanded reassurance that countermeasures existed. Engineers were asked a dangerous question. If we had to stop this, could we? The honest answer was no, but honesty rarely survives hierarchy, so the answer became conditional, hypothetical, dependent on ideal circumstances that never occur in reality. On paper, vulnerability reappeared. In practice, it vanished. Because American systems didn't depend on perfection, they thrived on imperfection. The next attempt to expose weakness was deliberate, a scenario engineered to overwhelm integration, multiple simultaneous disruptions, conflicting priorities, incomplete data, a nightmare on purpose.
This time, observers were confident. No system could handle this gracefully. And for a moment, it looked like they were right. American operations slowed. Indicators flashed yellow. Processes paused. Hope flickered. Then the slowdown stabilized, not into chaos, but into something else: degradation. The system shed complexity.
It simplified itself, reduced objectives, preserved core functions. It didn't fight to maintain full capability. It chose what mattered. That choice made all the difference. Others still tried to do everything. Americans did enough, and enough was sufficient. By the time the scenario concluded, the outcome was unavoidable. The Americans hadn't won because they were stronger. They had won because they were calmer. Calm, it turned out, was a strategic asset. The implications were disturbing. If American systems could scale down without collapsing, then escalation didn't guarantee advantage. Overwhelming force wouldn't overwhelm, only complicate. And complexity was where American systems thrived. One analyst wrote a line that never made it into an official report. They don't dominate by overpowering, they dominate by simplifying. That sentence circulated privately, then quietly disappeared, because it threatened too much. The focus shifted again, this time to people. Technology, they reasoned, could be copied eventually. Machines reverse-engineered, software replicated. But people were variables, and American people appeared different. Training footage revealed something subtle. American operators were encouraged to question, to improvise, to override systems when necessary, not as rebellion, but as responsibility. Mistakes weren't punished immediately, they were analyzed. That culture produced something rare: confidence without fear, and fearlessness without recklessness. Observers noted how junior personnel made decisions others reserved for senior command, not because hierarchy was ignored, but because trust flowed downward. Trust, however, was expensive. It required accepting risk, and risk was something other systems avoided at all costs. That avoidance now looked like weakness. Efforts to replicate American methods began cautiously. Pilot programs, controlled autonomy, limited discretion. The results were disappointing. Without cultural foundation, autonomy created confusion. Freedom without trust became disorder. American advantage wasn't just structural, it was philosophical. And philosophies aren't stolen, they're lived. As months passed, the gap widened, not dramatically, but steadily. American systems improved at a pace that defied traditional cycles. While others planned upgrades, Americans deployed them. While others tested concepts, Americans refined implementations. They didn't announce progress, they demonstrated it accidentally, through consistency, through reliability, through calm execution under pressure. Eventually, even denial lost credibility. The question shifted from, "Is America ahead?" to something far more troubling. How far ahead are they willing to admit? Because everything observed so far shared one trait. It was visible, which meant it was meant to be seen. And what nations choose to show is rarely their limit. One final insight emerged during a private exchange, unrecorded, unofficial, but remembered.
An American engineer was asked whether their systems ever truly reached capacity. He paused, then smiled slightly. "We don't build for capacity," he said. "We build for surprise." Surprise, the word lingered, because surprise favors those who expect it and destroys those who don't. By then, the truth had settled into something heavier than fear: acceptance. They hadn't been racing the Americans, they had been watching them disappear into the distance. And the most unsettling part wasn't how advanced American technology had become, it was how normal it seemed to them, as if this level of dominance wasn't extraordinary, just standard, just expected. Which raised a final, unavoidable question. If this was what America considered normal, what were they still holding back? The question lingered longer than anyone wanted. What were they still holding back? That uncertainty became its own form of pressure. When superiority is visible, it can be measured. When it is implied, it becomes unbearable. Analysts began revisiting everything they thought they knew about American restraint. The absence of escalation was no longer comforting. It was suspicious, because restraint, when paired with capability, is rarely accidental. The next revelation did not come from conflict or crisis, but from something far more revealing: routine cooperation, joint initiatives, shared standards, technical exchanges meant to promote stability. On paper, these were confidence-building measures. In practice, they became windows. American contributions arrived early, documentation was thorough, interfaces were clean, systems integrated effortlessly with foreign frameworks that struggled to keep up. It wasn't dominance by exclusion, it was dominance by compatibility. American systems didn't just work well with each other, they worked well with everything. That alone was disarming, because compatibility requires foresight. It means anticipating how others think, build, and fail. It means designing not just for your own advantage, but for inevitability, that your technology will become the standard others adapt to. And that is exactly what happened. Slowly, almost invisibly, American architectures became unavoidable. Supply chains aligned around them, protocols adjusted to them, training programs referenced them. Even rivals found themselves calibrating against American benchmarks, not because they were forced to, but because ignoring them became impractical. Dependence formed quietly, and dependence is power's most patient form. Some tried to resist, alternatives were promoted, domestic systems favored, parallel standards proposed, but fragmentation created friction, and friction cost time others didn't have. Meanwhile, American development continued at a pace that felt unfair, not because it was faster, but because it was smoother. Failures didn't stall progress, they refined it. Each setback produced data, and data fed improvement. There was no reset, only iteration.
One foreign engineer described it bitterly. They fail forward. That phrase spread, not officially, but widely. The next incident came without warning, a routine update, announced publicly, framed as maintenance. No secrecy, no urgency, just a scheduled improvement deployed across multiple platforms simultaneously. The effects were immediate. Systems that had struggled to keep pace suddenly fell behind again. Interoperability issues emerged overnight. Processes that once aligned now lagged. It wasn't sabotage, it was progress, and it revealed a harsh truth. Others weren't competing against American technology, they were chasing American momentum. Momentum once lost is difficult to regain. Internal frustration grew, questions sharpened. Why can't we match this speed? Why does every improvement they make widen the gap instead of narrowing it? The answers were uncomfortable. Because speed wasn't the cause, it was the result. American systems were built to evolve, others were built to endure. Endurance resists change, evolution demands it. That philosophical divide explained everything, and nothing, because philosophy doesn't stop outcomes. The final demonstration came not through dominance but generosity. An American proposal surfaced: shared infrastructure, access granted, capabilities offered. On the surface, it looked like cooperation. Behind the scenes, analysts froze, because accepting the offer meant aligning deeper, synchronizing further, adapting internal processes to American rhythms. Refusing meant isolation. Neither option felt safe. Some accepted cautiously and discovered something unsettling. The shared systems didn't constrain them, they empowered them. Productivity increased, reliability improved, bottlenecks disappeared. Problems that had plagued them for years dissolved quietly. The improvement was undeniable. So was the implication. American systems weren't designed to dominate through control, they dominated through enablement, which meant the more others relied on them, the stronger America became, without lifting a finger. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't an arms race, it was an ecosystem shift, and ecosystems don't collapse easily. They absorb, they adapt, they replace. The last attempt to challenge the narrative came from an unexpected place, a closed-door debate, senior voices, veteran strategists, people who had seen cycles rise and fall. They argued that dominance was temporary, that history always corrected itself. Someone younger asked a simple question: has it ever corrected itself this quietly? No one answered, because history's corrections are usually loud. This wasn't. This was smooth, predictable, almost boring, which made it terrifying. In the end, acceptance arrived not with surrender, but with adjustment. Language changed, objectives softened, confrontation was replaced with caution, strategy shifted from competition to coexistence.
Not because others suddenly believed America was unbeatable, but because they realized something worse. America didn't need to beat them. It just needed to keep going. And it would. Because what the world had mistaken for arrogance was something else entirely. Confidence built on preparation, calm rooted in redundancy, and superiority disguised as normalcy. The mockery had faded long ago, replaced by something far more telling: silence. And in that silence, a final understanding settled, heavy, unavoidable, and permanent. They hadn't underestimated American technology, they had misunderstood American thinking. And by the time they recognized the difference, it no longer mattered. Because the future had already chosen its architecture, and it was speaking with an American accent. Silence, however, does not mean peace. It means calculation. Once the realization settled that the future's architecture had already been decided, attention shifted to something far more uncomfortable than technology. If machines were no longer the battlefield, then perception was: influence, narrative, confidence. Because even superiority needs legitimacy, and legitimacy, once questioned, invites resistance. The first signs appeared subtly. Commentary changed tone. Analysts stopped dismissing American systems and started reframing them, not as superior, but as excessive, over-engineered, wasteful, dependent on endless resources. The argument wasn't that America wasn't ahead, it was that America couldn't sustain it. That story felt safer, because sustainability implies limits, and limits imply opportunity. So attention turned to cost: American budgets, American logistics, American reliance on global supply chains. Surely something that complex would eventually collapse under its own weight. Surely. But complexity didn't slow the Americans. It insulated them. Where others depended on single points of failure, Americans diversified. Where others centralized production, Americans distributed it. Where others stockpiled, Americans rotated. Efficiency wasn't sacrificed for redundancy, it was enhanced by it. One foreign planner noted bitterly that American systems behaved like living organisms. If one part weakened, others compensated, not perfectly, but effectively. That comparison was never published, because organisms adapt, and adaptation is hard to fight. The next attempt to expose weakness focused on morale. Technology, critics argued, only works if people believe in it. Americans, they claimed, had grown complacent, soft, too comfortable, too used to success. The assumption was old and repeatedly wrong. Evidence suggested the opposite. American operators trusted their systems, not blindly but confidently. They weren't intimidated by complexity because they understood it. Training emphasized comprehension over obedience, understanding over memorization. This produced something unexpected: ownership. When systems failed, Americans didn't wait for blame to be assigned.
They fixed them. When procedures broke, they revised them. Failure wasn't a threat, it was feedback. That mindset made morale resilient. Because resilience doesn't come from comfort, it comes from competence. The most telling moment occurred during a multinational crisis response, non-military, humanitarian. Infrastructure damaged, coordination fractured, time critical. Everyone participated, but one nation set the tempo. American systems integrated data from dozens of incompatible sources in hours. Tasking adjusted dynamically. Resources flowed where needed, when needed. Not flawlessly, but decisively. Others followed, not because they were ordered to, because it worked. Afterward, praise was public, gratitude expressed, cooperation celebrated. But privately, the same unsettling conclusion emerged. Even when the stakes weren't strategic, America led. Not through authority, through capability. That consistency destroyed the final illusion that American superiority was situational. It wasn't. It was structural. The final chapter of acceptance arrived quietly. No declarations, no treaties, just alignment. Standards converged. Training manuals referenced American methods. Software interfaces mirrored American logic. Even language shifted. Terms once dismissed as informal became official. No one announced this change, but everyone felt it. Because once a system becomes intuitive, alternatives feel inefficient. By then, mockery felt distant, embarrassing. Like laughing at something because it felt unfamiliar, only to realize it worked better than anything you had ever built. A senior figure, nearing retirement, summarized it privately. "We thought discipline would win," he said. "They thought adaptability would." He paused. They were right. That admission never reached the public. It didn't need to. Outcomes speak louder than words. Years later, historians would debate when the balance truly shifted. Some would point to crises, others to breakthroughs, others to policy decisions. They would all miss the point. The shift wasn't a moment, it was a mindset. The Americans didn't wait for history to favor them. They engineered conditions where history had fewer choices. That was the mistake others made. They thought superiority looked like dominance. They didn't recognize it when it looked like calm. By the time the lesson was learned, it was no longer useful, because the world had already adapted. Systems aligned, expectations changed, and what once seemed extraordinary became baseline, normal, which in the end was the most unsettling outcome of all. Not that American technology surpassed everyone else, but that it did so quietly, methodically, without needing permission and without needing to say out loud what everyone had eventually come to understand. They mocked American technology until it became the standard they could no longer escape. Years passed, and what once felt like an advantage hardened into gravity, not forceful, not dramatic.
Just unavoidable. New generations entered institutions already shaped by American standards. They didn't remember the mockery. They inherited the results. To them, American systems weren't superior. They were familiar. Baseline. The way things were supposed to work. That normalization was the final victory. Because once superiority becomes invisible, resistance loses its language. Attempts to reassert independence grew quieter, not abandoned, just reframed. Strategic autonomy, regional solutions, words chosen carefully, stripped of confrontation. The ambition remained, but the confidence didn't. Too many systems depended on American logic now. Too many workflows assumed American design choices. Even dissent relied on platforms built elsewhere. That irony went mostly unspoken, until one moment cracked the illusion. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't even political. It was an audit, a routine internal review meant to identify long-term vulnerabilities. The question was simple. If access were suddenly restricted, temporarily, hypothetically, how would systems respond? The answer was sobering. Redundancies existed, contingencies had been planned, but adaptation timelines stretched uncomfortably long. Weeks, months, years. Not because replacements didn't exist, because integration did. Everything touched everything else. The realization landed quietly but heavily. Dependence had already formed, not imposed, chosen. And reversing choice is harder than resisting force. The uncomfortable truth was this. American dominance no longer required American action. It persisted through inertia alone. That meant something else, too. If America ever chose to move faster, no one would stop it. That possibility reshaped strategic thinking overnight, not publicly, privately.
Policies softened, postures adjusted, escalation scenarios rewritten. The question was no longer how to challenge American leadership, but how to avoid provoking it. That shift marked the end of an era. Because deterrence once relied on parity, now it relied on uncertainty. Uncertainty about how much more capability existed beyond what was visible. Because everyone now understood one thing: America never showed everything. They never needed to. Their true advantage wasn't secrecy, it was selectivity. They revealed just enough to shape behavior, just enough to set standards, just enough to let others assume the rest. And assumptions filled in the gaps, sometimes generously, sometimes fearfully, but always in America's favor. The final confirmation came from an unexpected source, a defector, not of ideology, but of expertise. Someone who had worked across systems, across borders, across decades. He wasn't dramatic, he didn't seek asylum or attention, he simply spoke. And what he said unsettled everyone who listened. "We kept asking how to catch up," he explained, "but we were asking the wrong question." He paused. "We should have asked how they kept changing the race." That insight reframed everything.
America didn't defend its lead. It redefined the finish line. Every time others approached parity, the criteria shifted, not arbitrarily, but logically, toward flexibility, toward integration, toward resilience. Others trained for the test. America redesigned the curriculum. And by the time that became obvious, it was already too late to matter. The defector was dismissed publicly, his statements labeled subjective, his credibility questioned. Privately, his words spread because they explained too much. They explained why copying hardware failed, why replicating software lagged, why mirroring doctrine felt hollow. Because the advantage wasn't any single component, it was coherence, a system where incentives, culture, technology, and trust all pointed in the same direction, forward. The last illusion to die was the belief that this dominance required intention. It didn't. It emerged naturally from alignment. While others argued over control, America optimized flow. While others demanded certainty, America prepared for surprise. While others planned for stability, America assumed disruption. That assumption paid off endlessly. And then, almost as an afterthought, something remarkable happened. America slowed down. Not out of weakness, out of choice. Because once you are far enough ahead, speed becomes optional, control becomes refinement, and refinement becomes invisible to those still struggling to keep up. That slowdown confused observers. Some mistook it for decline. They were wrong. It was consolidation. The kind that follows victory so complete it no longer needs reinforcement. And in that quiet phase, more than any dramatic moment before, the truth became undeniable. The era of mockery hadn't ended with humiliation, it had ended with irrelevance, because no one mocks what they depend on, and no one challenges what they quietly accept as permanent. By the time the world realized this, there was nothing left to challenge, only systems to operate, standards to follow, and a future already built, piece by piece, choice by choice, long before anyone noticed it was American. The admission never came in a speech. It never appeared in a document. It surfaced in behavior. Years after the mockery had faded and dependence had normalized, something subtle became impossible to ignore. Whenever a major decision loomed, technological, strategic, infrastructural, eyes turned instinctively in one direction, not for permission, for alignment. Plans were drafted with an unspoken question embedded inside them. Will this still work if the Americans move first? Budgets were approved with a similar hesitation. Will this remain relevant if American systems evolve again? That reflex revealed more than any confession ever could, because no one measures themselves against something they consider inferior. The final proof arrived during a moment of global uncertainty. No single event, just convergence.
economic strain, technological acceleration, political fragmentation.
The kind of environment where leadership fractures. Instead, one system absorbed the pressure. American infrastructure flexed without breaking. Supply chains rerouted. Digital frameworks adapted. Institutions argued publicly but functioned privately. The machinery of the system kept moving even while the surface looked chaotic. Observers waited for collapse. It didn't come. They waited for overreach. It didn't happen. They waited for exhaustion. Instead, they saw calibration. That restraint unsettled them more than aggression ever could, because restraint implies choice, and choice implies surplus. The most revealing moment occurred far from cameras during a closed technical forum. No press, no speeches, just specialists comparing notes. One participant finally asked the question that had hovered for decades. When did you realize you were ahead? The American representative didn't answer immediately. Then he said something unexpected. "We didn't," he replied. "We just kept fixing what broke." The room went quiet, because that answer destroyed the last comforting myth, that American dominance was the result of obsession, ambition, or intent. It wasn't. It was the byproduct of a system that rewarded correction instead of denial. That realization hit harder than any display of power, because it meant there was no switch to flip, no policy to reverse, no weakness to exploit. You can't outmaneuver a process that improves by default. The irony became impossible to escape. The mockery at the beginning had been logical, based on appearances. American systems did look messy, decentralized, informal, too human. What critics failed to understand was that those qualities weren't flaws, they were features. Messiness allowed adaptation, decentralization enabled speed, humanity created ownership. By the time rivals recognized this, they were no longer competing against machines, they were competing against momentum. And momentum, once established, doesn't need defense, it only needs time. The final generation of skeptics faded quietly. Retirements replaced confrontations, manuals replaced manifestos, training replaced ideology. No one announced surrender because there was nothing to surrender to. There was only reality. A reality where American systems weren't feared, they were assumed. An assumption is the deepest form of dominance. Today, no one laughs, not because they are afraid, but because there is nothing left to mock. Mockery requires distance, and distance no longer exists. The systems they once dismissed now define the environment they operate in. The standards they resisted now shape their decisions. The philosophy they rejected now underpins their survival. And somewhere in the background, uninterested, unbothered, the American system continues doing what it has always done, adjusting, refining, preparing for surprise. Without needing applause, without needing acknowledgement, without ever having to say the words everyone already understands.
They mocked American technology until it quietly rewrote the rules. And by the time anyone noticed, there were no other rules left to follow.